from the Collective Good Podcast. Back on the Placemakers at my favorite time of the week. It is the time when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends. Really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. And we are live once again. You are joining me at my favorite time of the week. It's when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends to talk about the future of higher education. And today we have what we are coining a mega show. Hopefully in post-production, I can put some sort of echo on mega show because our placemakers are Elizabeth Johnson, chairman of Simpson Scarborough, and Brandon Bustede is back on the pod, president of university partnerships at Kaplan. And just a little setup about what we're going to talk about today, because this is a huge opportunity for us. Back in April, Simpson Scarborough released the second wave of a study that they had done that really made some predictions and gave us some data related to how the industry was responding to what's happening with regards to coronavirus and COVID. And they were a little bit gloomy. Many articles were written about them. And now we have a treat on our hands. Now that it's August, now that we've turned that corner, now that we're much closer to understanding reality, Elizabeth's come on the show to give us an update. They've done an update of that study and the new data is here. And as a secondary treat, Brandon is joining us to help us think about what the heck can we do about it, but both short-term and long-term, what ought we be thinking? And so I want to jump in and start with you, Elizabeth, and with the big question from a data perspective. Back in April, when you talked about your data, your big takeaway and what we saw all over the news at that time was, look, enrollment is going to be down 20% across the sector. How close were you, or where are you feeling about that today? Now that we've crossed that threshold of April, it's April, or August, it's August 3rd now. How close did you get?
Well, you're going to be mad at me because I'm not going to give you an update on that figure today. And so what happened was it's coming. I know. And I promise you that's not just a tease. We just collected this data from July 16th to July 27th. So we pulled the data out of the field literally 1 week ago, 7 days ago today. So I have a lot of data points so far, but we haven't analyzed it carefully enough to say, here's how much we predict that enrollment is going to be down. We will be publishing the full report next week, and we will have that prediction in there, but we want to be really careful about it, especially because so many people paid attention to it the last time around. We're not trying to freak everybody out. We don't want to, say the world is on fire if it's not. We don't want to overestimate or underestimate. So I'm going to hold off on that prediction, but I will tell you a couple of things. And all of these data points really show how volatile the marketplace still is. I'm hearing from a lot of college presidents and a lot of chief marketing and enrollment officers that they're actually feeling pretty good, right? Like deposits look good, students are signing up. Thank goodness for that. And I think, there's an incredible wave of passion for the in-person, educational experience right now. Kids want to if we're talking about the traditional, college age, population, they want to get back to their campuses, right? We all know that from both qualitative and quantitative research. But let me share a couple figures with you. Of the students who have been given the option to return to their campus, so eliminating the UC system that said you can't come back, just isolating kids who've been given the chance to come back, only 72% told us in their survey that they're going. 17%, 17% said they're not going, and 10% don't know yet.
Wow. So institutions who are giving students an option to come back. Now, does that include hybrid models whereby people have a physical presence on campus? Okay. So in a model whereby you can either come back physically for in-person classes or a hybrid model, what are those numbers of people who said A, they're either unsure, or B, they're not going to come back?
It's 17.4% who said they're not going back, even though they've been given the option to do so.
Wow.
And about 10.5% who said they're not sure yet. So it's a total of about 28% of kids who can go back, but either won't or haven't decided yet.
So that's really interesting. I've heard the same things that you've heard, which is every meeting that I'm in, every roundtable that I'm in, every conversation that I'm in, everybody says, our numbers are strong. And our students and our parents keep telling us they want to come back, but it all feels very anecdotal. And the numbers feel like everybody's reporting the same student in all of their data sets, which just really, really can't work.
And the world is shifting beneath their feet, right? I mean, kids are being given the option to come back and given the option to register for classes that they think are going to be in person. And then several weeks later, they find out, yeah, you can be on campus, but you'll be taking that class from your dorm room. Right. And that's actually the least preferred option of all the ones that we tested. What the least preferred option was actually going back to campus, but having to take all of your classes online.
So I can't remember any time like this in the history of the industry at all, of course. And you spent a lot of time talking about communication in the last webinar, and you talked about one of your big tips was, hey, institutions, make sure you do a good job of communication. We just saw, I think it was an Inside Higher Ed article about the 4 things that would make students come back to campus, and one was transparent communication that helped people understand. I'm going to ask Brandon this because you watch the industry as close as anybody has. Knowing that was Simpson and Scarborough's recommendation to do that really, really well. How did we do? Have we done that well?
You've seen a mix of stuff all over the place, TJ. I mean, Elizabeth, you've seen it too. There have been institutions that I think have done a remarkable job with very transparent, open communications while still providing a lot of details, including things like, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know is a perfectly legitimate answer that I think more institutions should have given, could have given. And so, look, I think the answer is it really depends on who you audit, right? But there were clearly several examples out there that, I won't necessarily mention by name that I think, were not at all helpful or were so strong on one end of the spectrum of their, opinion of like, we're going to be back on campus 100% or, whatever. And they're having to come off of that because look, this is an entirely volatile situation. It'd be one thing if the country was going in a much different direction with the the COVID numbers. It has been, a disaster over the last month and a half. So think about the communications that were going out a month and a half ago when, it was starting to look like it was trending down for a consistent period of time in terms of number of cases. Deaths were trending down, and here we are again, probably as bad as it's ever been, you could argue. So the communication game has not ended. It's just the very beginning of this. Because if we're not careful, we could end up having a worse fall than spring in terms of student experience. The disaster that we think was the spring. The fall could be even worse because people have an expectation that schools have had time to figure out some plans. And my worry is they really haven't. Right. Because it's such a fluid, dynamic situation.
Well, and I was going to ask that, is that your sort of finger on the pulse of what the industry has done? My sense is that from a consumer perspective, parents, students, families feel like, because I remember hearing in your original data, Elizabeth, that students basically said, look, you were bad at online education. You sucked at it, get better at it, right? And as a consumer, I'm going to look at that and go, well, the institution has now had months to pivot. However, I'm not sure how many institutions actually pivoted. It feels like the decision point we were at many months ago was planning to come back, and that a lot of people have not moved off of that point until very, very, very recently as things have continued to shift and move. And so do we expect that as people come back that there may be some disappointment in what the delivery is actually going to be yet again, or that we haven't pivoted as far as we should have?
Oh, definitely. I mean, kids hated online learning. I mean, I think that's true for kindergartners through college students. Mm-hmm. I mean, they said that it was just, it was far worse than in-person learning. And, going back to some of what Brandon was talking a minute ago about the communications, our study actually shows that students' opinions of the communications have gotten worse, not better, since April. I mean, we had 20% of returning college students in April say that their university's communications around COVID were fair or poor. That's 38%. Wow. In July. So it's almost doubled, right? We have not gotten, as a whole, I'm sure there are isolated cases, right, where people, institutions have gotten better, and individual institutions' ratings might have gotten better. But across the board, the fair to poor rating of university communications went from 20% to 38%.
And I remember you saying that the students that said they didn't feel their institution communicated well, whether it be that they didn't communicate quickly enough or they weren't accurate, whatever it was, it actually soured their perspective on the actual institution reputationally.
Still true. Those are completely correlated. If they think your communications are poor, they're also having a more negative opinion of the institution overall.
So let's shift a little bit to some of these modes of delivery. I've watched religiously your Simpson and Scarborough tool for tracking how institutions are planning to come back. And every day, sometimes multiple times a day, I'll admit it, I get in, I hit refresh, and I want to see what direction the arrows are going as it relates to in-person, hybrid, and online. And of course, watch the change over time and move the days and things like that. What are students telling us about their preferred mode of delivery of education given the circumstances of this COVID world?
Well, it's interesting. So I just mentioned a minute ago that the least preferred option is returning to campus, but having to take all your classes online, right? I mean, it's only 9% of returning students who picked that option when we gave it to them, and 13% of entering freshmen. So let me go through the top choices though, because they're actually different for returning college students and entering freshmen.
Yeah.
The returning students, I know, interesting. The returning students, their top choice is to return to campus for a hybrid model. 41% said they want to go back to campus and take some combination of courses in person and online. Their second choice at 31% is to stay home and take all their classes remotely.
Wow.
Now, here's the interesting thing. For the freshmen, that's reversed, right? For the freshmen, 39% of kids who are entering as freshmen this fall, it's the top choice of all four that we gave them. They want to stay home.
So that was almost 40%, you said?
Yeah, 39%. And the second choice is the hybrid model at 30%.
So two things come to mind for me when you say that. One is the bottom may still drop out of this thing even further as we continue down the road of August, particularly as you've already said, not everybody's decided, and the preferred method of delivery. The second thing that comes to mind for me is what you presented back in April, which was that incoming students were telling us if things were online, they didn't necessarily want to come. Do I remember that right?
You do remember that, right? That's changing a little bit, right? People are getting a little bit more comfortable with a hybrid model, right? And they're also getting more scared about the virus, right? So a higher percentage now is saying, actually, I'm getting a little comfortable with staying home and taking my courses remotely because I don't want to get sick. And as we're going to discuss in a few minutes, kids don't trust their fellow classmates.
I can't wait to get to that part.
The rules. That's a big problem.
But before we do get to that part, Brandon, what does this tell us when we think about students' willingness to do things online? Because I think if we would have gone back to March as everything was pivoting to online, it all felt like it was very reactive. And I even remember you, Elizabeth, saying in the webinar that there was this sort of anecdotal, colloquial feeling that, this is going to make people want to do online classes more to reduce the cost of higher education, and that we may be putting ourselves in a really bad spot as a traditional industry. And your data at the time didn't point to that. But now it's starting to point to that a little bit, which is really, really interesting. And so I wonder in the big grand scheme of things, Brandon, does this point to some opportunities that we might have as an industry to actually pivot a little bit? Again, the data before didn't really point to it, but maybe it does now.
Well, look, there's a really important distinction that we all need to keep remembering, right? Is that there's a big difference between the dissatisfaction with the hastily rushed emergency move to distance education that was forced upon all of these institutions in the spring versus what I would call professionally developed, intentionally designed online education, which, by the way, is receiving incredible scores from students, right? So data I just went through last week from the Strata Education Consumer Survey showed that recent graduates of online universities rated the quality of their experience higher than recent graduates of traditional universities. That is mind-blowing. Now, but here's the big difference, right? These are professionally developed, intentionally designed online courses, right? And so that's just an important thing that we need to hold out. Now, back to your point about this incoming freshman class, returning students. We're mainly talking about students on traditional campuses. And you can see, I think it makes sense that freshmen would say, you know what, if I can't start in a way that makes sense, I'll stay home and I'll do it online. The other assumption that I think a lot of people are making is that going back to campus is going to be awesome. Yeah. Well, the way that we are going to be doing college this fall is not going to look anything like it was in its pre-COVID days, right? social distancing, wearing masks, right? Frequent testing. There's probably not going to be, a tenth of what the traditional extracurricular activities are. So I think there's a lot of incoming freshmen. They haven't made friends with new, people yet. If I'm a returning student, I at least know I can go back and see some of my friends. I get it, right? But that's the other mistake that we shouldn't make, is students and parents shouldn't assume that being on campus is going to be superior to being online, because both of them are just going to be very, very different this year. I'm not going to say one is going to be better than the other. They're both going to be very different experiences than most of us are used to.
Well, and may we've come to that realization a little bit as a society, that going back to college isn't going to be awesome, right? Like, now that we've experienced the world in a mask and the world with social distancing, maybe it's not going to be as awesome as we had initially hoped or intended that it might be. But I also wonder, as we think about student preferences, and particularly that piece that really sticks out to me is freshmen saying, number one is stay home and take my classes online. I wonder what impact the end of the academic year of high school and doing so much online may have had. And I wonder if, and Brandon, you may or may not have any insight into this, I wonder what we know about the quality of what high schools have done and how that's going to compare to the quality of what higher education is prepared to do.
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any evidence, for example, that high schools this year did a better job in the transition to distance learning than colleges did on average, right? I think they all struggled. Some, it was way worse because they didn't have basic software and technology relationships in place, where, I saw it here locally at Fairfax County Public Schools. I mean, it was really rough. Like, they had to basically just stop education because they couldn't figure out how to do the distance part. So look, I don't think there's any evidence of that. That said, I do think, there are new, I'll call them archetypes of students that are, that were evident before this pandemic, right? And are now becoming more evident. And that is that this isn't for everybody, but there is a growing population of traditional 18-year-olds who, if they can do it cheaper and faster and live at home and maybe work while they're doing it, they will do an online degree, right? Those numbers were rising. If you look at the 18 to 24-year-olds at big institutions like UMGC or Southern New Hampshire or Western Governors, right? Those numbers were increasing, what I'll call the traditional age students in non-traditional higher ed. And so, I think the pandemic is going to accelerate this. Hard to predict exactly how much. And again, I want to state this. This isn't for everybody. There are still going to be the returning diehard, I want the residential 4-year college experience marketplace, but those numbers are dwindling, right? And you're going to see an increase in those who are going, hey, I could do this less expensively. I can do it quicker potentially, right? I can pretty much do year-round school. These are all the advantages of what the adult learning market has, tapped into over the past couple decades. So you're going to see that happen more. It's not unusual. It's just going to be happening more with 18 to 22-year-olds as opposed to the working adult population that we've traditionally thought of as the fully online student.
Well, and I wonder, one of the outcomes that's been predicted of this adjustment and this shift is that we're going to only see the access issue in higher education sort of further emphasized in terms of who has access and who doesn't, and that the traditional college experience will likely, because of the price point, be reserved for a certain sort of group in terms of socioeconomic status, and these other options, whether they be through partnership with employers, as you've sort of mentioned as an option, Brandon, or whether it be through online or community colleges, things like that, is for everybody else. Are you seeing anything in the data, Elizabeth, that points to disparities as it relates to race? Because I know you collected that data and I know you controlled for that. Are you learning anything about the background of a student and how that's impacting the way they're making decisions about these things?
Oh, we saw this going back to our first study in March. And it was really exacerbated by the study in April. I mean, we had pages of differences in how COVID was affecting students by race and ethnicity. Far greater negative impact on Black and Hispanic families than on white families, far greater impact on first generation families. So that's undeniable, that the impact is greater. Those students of color are changing their minds about where they want to go. They are attributing those decisions to COVID. They are saying that they're not going to go to school at all now because of COVID at far higher rates than white students. So it's undeniable. The impact is very, very different for students of color.
And I wonder what that means in terms of could we, because this supposedly was going to be the year that we saw the most diverse college class in the history of our country, and it was going to be the first year that there were less white students enrolled in college than there were minority or students of color for the first time ever. Could that be reversed a little bit because of some of the financial impacts of this thing? I mean, if what you're seeing is what you're seeing, could we see, and I'm just talking about on-campus population, could we actually see a less diverse on-campus population across the sector?
Our data shows it's very possible.
Wow. I mean, that's absolutely amazing in terms of what we think about the impact to the industry and steps forward or steps back.
And in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement too. I mean,
Sure.
it's so discouraging because that's what everyone's working toward right now, and yet we're sliding.
Right. And your first your March April piece that happened in advance of the George Floyd piece that's happened now in our country, and in some of the civil unrest that's happened as a result of that, or has grown from that as an event. And so it's really interesting to think about whether that may have pushed your data a little bit further one direction or the other. And I don't know if you know that now.
No, we don't know for sure, but it is interesting because I remember back when we were talking to different media outlets when we released our April study, and we knew about all these racial differences, and no one was asking us those questions about what are those differences. And I would never let any reporter get off the phone with me without saying, wait a minute, there's one more thing I have to tell you. There's these huge disparities by race. And I thought people would write about it more, and they didn't, and I'm hoping they will this time. Thank you, George Floyd. Because it's a really important message that needs to get through. Yeah.
Well, there was an interesting article I saw today, and this is another layer, that talked about the way that HBCUs have cared for their students, and in a way that is very different than other types of institutions in their COVID response, in their planning for being on campus, in the way that they're treating them financially. And I think there's something there in terms of not just messaging, but in terms of the way these institutions operate. And Brandon, you and I have talked about Paul Quinn and Michael Sorrell several times, and the way that he's run his show there. And so I'm just really curious to see how that layer emerges amongst the other layers of data and what we learn about institutions. Specifically, I want to understand a little bit better about diversification of institutions. And Brandon, we talked about this last time that you were on the show. If presumably, one, I want to understand from both of your perspectives, do we think that this impact to demand is temporary or long-term? Knowing we were already going to be in an enrollment drought, we were already off the cliff, and it's been accelerated now. Do we think this is a temporary hit or a much more long-term hit? And if it is, what types of things, because I'm interested so much in placemaking, what types of things should institutions be doing to really set themselves apart from everybody else in what could be a very, very scary time from an enrollment decline perspective?
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I actually had a question for you that follows up on TJ's point on the Black and Hispanic families. Are they? Is it more they're rethinking their college choice, like choosing a different option, or is it I'm choosing not to enroll more? I'm just curious how much of the mix is one versus the other.
It was both. Both of those figures were higher for Black and Hispanic families than they were for white families, unfortunately.
Yeah, because that, one part is going to be, what are the options that they choose within the college options, right? Is this downshifts from, a type of institution to another? Is it a closer institution where I can live at home? Is it an online institution so that I can live at home? I mean, there's just a lot of different pieces in there that I think we are going to have to, get to, a better job of understanding. If I'm a traditional residential campus, though, the writing is on the wall based on that data that there very well could be a less diverse class at a time when you've got more pressure on financial aid and financial support than ever, right? So you could argue these institutions are going to be even more handicapped in providing support and aid than they've ever been. When you look at the expectations for lost auxiliary services revenue, I was doing the math for just one university that announced that they were going to go online in the fall. And it's $46 million in lost auxiliary services revenue just for the fall.
Tens of millions of dollars.
Just for the fall, right?
And then throw athletics in there. Throw athletics in if they're
Didn't even calculate that. Just looked at room and board. Just the room and board for one semester, right? So
you're not talking about the enrollment drop. You're not, and the tuition costs and the everything else. You're not talking about that. And I think there's a real cost to loss and diversity too, to institutions, to culturally what can happen at an institution of higher education. And I remain very curious about what HBCUs are doing that is very special. We've seen now top basketball recruits for the first time in history saying that we are going to commit to an HBCU over some of these big name institutions. And I wonder if all of this is layered on top of itself.
Yeah, and that goes back to your question about whether or not this is temporary or permanent. I can answer that question with my head or my heart. In my head, looking at all these financial challenges that the institutions are facing, combine that with the demographic cliff, combine that with the fact that all these traditional age students are experiencing higher education in a different way and may ultimately realize they prefer that. My head says this could be a permanent challenge. But I also hear students on the other side of it. So I'm not making a prediction here. I'm just laying out what we're hearing. And I think I mentioned this back in our April webinar. We're doing a lot of qualitative research with students as well, and they are exhibiting this passionate desire to get back to their campuses. I mean, these are kids who, were kind of indifferent about getting back to their campuses or kind of complaining about going back to school a year ago. And now they want to get there in the worst way. They want to get out of their parents' house. They're sick of being with their families. They don't want to do online learning. They can't learn differential equations online. It's one of my favorite quotes from a student. And so it could be that this leads to a resurgence. This is my heart speaking, right? This is what I want to see happen, a resurgence of interest in the traditional on-campus, high-touch higher education experience. So I really think the jury is still out, because these kids, it's kind of like, something that they have been working for their whole lives has been ripped away from them. And nothing makes you want something more than thinking that you're getting something and then having it taken away, right? Sure. So it could, next fall, we could have a resurgence of interest in the in-person experience. You just never know.
I almost wonder if the opposite will happen, only, to play devil's advocate, that your data shows that returning students are more eager to return than incoming students are to get there. Yeah. And I wonder if we look at, what this pivot, that we will have more students who don't quote unquote want it or expect to have it as we have in the past, and that this does really represent a huge shift in terms of people's expectation, because the students who've been waiting 18 years to have it are not the ones telling you that they want it so bad to come back. It's the ones who've already gotten a taste of it.
True.
Yeah. So what happens when they don't? I want to shift a little bit and turn a corner and talk about what happens once student arrive, because I think there's two parts to this narrative right now. There's the part whereby we continuously have heard higher ed leaders say students want to be back on campus. I mean, you just said that students want to be back on campus, and it's been a little bit anecdotal, and now we've got some data that tells us exactly who wants to be back on campus and to what degree they want to be back on campus. So I think that's very, very interesting. The other thing we're hearing institutions say, particularly those institutions who are saying we're going to be face-to-face because students want this, they need it, is that the students who want this and need it want it so badly that they're going to take care of it. They're going to protect it. And I've seen countless number of videos and pledges and conversations and slogans about how we've made this a community effort. We're in this together, and it's going to work because we all care about it so much. What do you know about whether that's true or not?
We know a lot. And I'll be curious to hear what you think about these data points. So first of all, right off the top, we know that 75% of both new and returning students are either somewhat or very worried about contracting the virus when they go back to campus. And those figures are way higher right now in the South, if that's where the student lives, or the West, right, where we're seeing outbreaks right now. It's much lower among students who live in the Northeast and the Midwest. Of course, so all, related to where the outbreaks are, and I think we'll see that change as the outbreak moves around the country. So let me know what you think about this. 54% of returning college students strongly agree that they will follow their institution's COVID guidelines. Does that number seem high or low to you?
Just 54%?
Exactly. I didn't want to, influence you in any way adding the word just. I mean, another 36% agree that they will. So together, oftentimes we add together the agree and the strongly agree, and that's 90% of returning students who say they will follow the guidelines. But the only 54% who strongly agree compared to the 36% who are a little bit wishy-washy about following the guidelines. I mean, as we were talking before we started the podcast, it only takes that less than that 36% to just send the virus across the whole campus. So those numbers are concerning.
Well, it's particularly interesting to think about those numbers in contrast to the data you have that says returning students want to be back, but yet there's only half of them that strongly agree they're going to follow the guidelines that have been set forth. That's a little bit scary to me. Mm-hmm. The other piece is reporting the other side of that data. That also tells me that 10% answered that they wouldn't follow the guidelines.
That's right.
And that's more than enough.
Exactly. Well, and let me know what you think about this too. 81% of returning students and only 74% of new students said that yes, they would follow a pledge to follow the guidelines. 80% of returning, 74% of new. I mean, there's a huge portion of students who are saying no, or I don't know if I will sign a pledge.
Right. And I don't know if you've looked at these data next to one another, but do those students who happen to say, I don't know if I'm going to follow the pledge, are those also the ones who are sort of wishy-washy on their commitment to returning?
Good question. I don't know yet, but we'll make sure to answer that when we publish the report.
Yeah. Very curious.
The more interesting finding too is about trusting your fellow students. It was only 7% of returning college students who strongly agreed that they trust their fellow students to follow the guidelines.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what about our incoming class?
21%. Three times higher, but still only 1 in 5. I mean, here's the thing. 40% of returning students disagreed or strongly disagreed that they trust their fellow students to follow the guidelines.
Wow. So if I go back to the premise, which is that this is all going to work because our students care enough to take care of it. I use the NBA analogy a lot. I feel like the NBA has done a good job of saying we care enough about basketball to do this right. We're going to put a bubble together. You don't get in unless you've been tested, and once you're out, you're out. And they've safely now played their sport. I don't know that Major League Baseball or anyone else for that matter really has said, I care enough about this sport to do it the right way. What we're saying is that our students care enough about their institution and their education and their community that they're going to come back and they're going to pledge and they're going to follow these guidelines to a T. And what your data is saying that huge swaths of them are not. And not only that, but they don't trust each other to do it either.
Exactly. And what it tells the institutions is how much time and effort they're going to have to put into enforcing these rules. Right. I mean, that's the real message to the colleges and universities out there, is that you cannot trust is not enough. Right. I mean, there's going to have to be policing and discipline and monitoring.
She was on a roll.
Yeah, she was. We lost Elizabeth, but that's okay. We'll continue to move forward. She's back.
And she's back. Yeah.
Elizabeth had a huge hailstorm going on in her place, and we've got her back now. So you were on a roll. You're gonna have to unmute. She's back. All right, perfect.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. And so you were saying policing. We got to do some policing.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to take a lot of work. The colleges are not going to be able to just rely on trust alone. They're not going to say, okay, well, we forced our students to sign a pledge and now they're going to follow all the rules, right? I mean, it's going to be a lot of work, time and effort on their part to make sure that the rules are actually followed. I mean, look at, we found that only half of the kids who are going back to campus said that they would sign up to use a contact tracing app. I mean, half of the people signing up to use a contact tracing app doesn't work, right? You have to have 100% signed up to use a contact tracing app. Otherwise, there's no use in doing it for anyone. And so I think there's a big wall for these colleges to get over. It's going to be a heavy lift for them to enforce the rules that they have in place.
So I don't want to be an alarmist either. I know you say that all the time. You don't want to be an alarmist on this thing, and I know you don't. But this data,
No.
it really is scary. I think it's scary for any institution that's saying we're going to open online and we're going to trust our students. Brandon, what's your over/under for when higher education completely shuts down the world? Is it September 15? Or I'm kidding you. I wouldn't ask you to put that out there. But in all honesty, what do you think? higher education ought to be doing right now? What should we be doing to react and respond? This is all new data. Nobody's seen this yet, and you're going to do a more formal presentation of this in the coming weeks and in webinars. And I know we're going to see articles on all of the different outlets. Let's get ahead of it and prognosticate a little bit. What do we anticipate the influence of data like this is going to have on the industry as we continue to roll forward?
I hope it helps them prepare and be realistic about what to expect. To be realistic about how many kids are actually going to show up, because we're some schools have already opened, and many are opening within the next 2 to 3 weeks, and it's going to be a very volatile situation until that actually happens. That, like I said before, the ground is shifting beneath students' feet. Like even my daughter, who's going to go to Penn State as a freshman this fall, when she registered for her classes, 3 out of the 5 of them were in person. Now all 5 are online. So she's in that pool of students who's going to campus, moving in, willingly doing it, signing the pledge, but all of her classes are going to be from her dorm room. And so, it's all changing. And even in the next, 3 to 4 weeks as the colleges open, there could be a lot of different decisions made by the kids. The colleges have to get ready for that. And then they have to be very, very realistic about what it's going to require to keep their campuses safe, because, the students are, they're too wishy-washy on their plans for adhering to the rules. I mean, one of the things I didn't even tell you is that only about 80% of kids said they would wear masks inside buildings when they go to campuses. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to scare the crap out of everybody, right? I mean, but it's going to be a big lift to enforce these rules.
And so, Brandon, what do you prognosticate will be? I mean, this is huge data. This is a big deal. I am a little bit shocked by some of this in terms of what to anticipate. No, that's okay. This is great. We need to know this. We need to prepare. Yeah. But what do you anticipate from a student behavior perspective? And so, if you had to prognosticate a little bit, how do you think this could impact the industry? Do you think we're going to see more shifts in decision making in terms of who's going to deliver online and who's not? Do you think we're going to see just a shift in how students are making decisions? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I started my career in higher ed as a student leader trying to come up with alcohol-free social life alternatives on college campuses. And let's just say that learning from that experience might actually have some applicability here. To expect that everybody's going to follow rules and everybody's going to be on good behavior is, magical thinking. And look, I would say we on many sides here, we need to have some reasonable expectations of what's going to happen, right? For a university, I think you should under-promise and work to over-deliver, right? Over-promising and under-delivering is going to be where there's going to be a real recipe for disaster. I think for students and parents, come into this with a realistic expectation. Online probably won't be great. There's a good chance it won't be any different than it was in the spring, even though universities have had plenty of time to improve on it. By the way, coming to campus isn't going to be what it was billed to be, in your mind a year ago, right? And look, these are difficult things, right? Have a little understanding in this situation, right? Demanding that it's going to be like it always was, right? Like that is not going to be a productive stance for anybody. And I'm not saying, you don't try to become a smart consumer of what's going on. Ultimately, TJ and Elizabeth, what I see happening right now is that we have now turned the higher ed student and parent into a much more sophisticated consumer of this amazing thing we call higher ed. And they're starting to ask questions that now, once they've asked them, once they're out there, it's like you can't unsee these things, right? You can't unsee the reality of, hey, am I really paying this much for the actual degree and the education, or am I paying it for the experience and the extracurriculars and the answer is it's a mix across all these things. But now when you start to say, well, how much value do I assign to this part versus this part? This is where the great unbundling can really start to begin. And so look, I think this is just going to be a really rough fall. I think it could be worse than the spring because of some of the, expectations that I mentioned before. But this is the moment where higher ed has to think really seriously about how fast it can get itself in position to diversify its revenue sources and diversify how it thinks about enrollment, right? So for example, if we measure enrollment by how many students are pursuing a degree, we could see a big drop in enrollment in higher ed, right, over the next 6 to 12 months. But if you start to measure enrollment based on how many students are going to a university, either online or in some other hybrid fashion, to get upskilled for a job, right, to learn how to become a contact tracer, to go through a data science boot camp. I mean, I'm just going to make up a bunch of examples. Well, it could be a growth time, because here's my more optimistic side of this equation. Elizabeth, you said this a little bit too. Usually in an economic downturn, what do we know about higher ed? Enrollments in higher ed go up. So you ask the question, okay, it might not be a great experience this year, but what else are people going to do, right? There aren't a lot of jobs out there. Unemployment's as high as we've ever seen it. So for an 18-year-old who has no experience, there's not a lot of other options than thinking about, hey, if college was something I was already considering, I should stay that path. Where we're going to see the big shifts, though, are I'm going to do a less expensive path. I'm going to do a faster path. I'm going to do a more work-aligned path, because I can't allow this to potentially, not succeed in terms of economic earnings, right?
Right.
So those are the shifts that I think we're going to see more than anything. But, you could see some, I could argue either way. We're going to see higher ed enrollments go up. We're going to see them go down. But I think you'd have to include enrollments in non-degree programs in that analysis too. So
and community colleges and all kinds of things that are sort of that non-traditional 4-year degree path. One last question really for you, Elizabeth, because I'm interested in how we continue on this journey of measuring the impacts of this moment in time. And one of my big concerns, I had a conversation with a colleague today about the fact that there are a number of factors that impact an incoming student's ability to be retained. And a lot of those things happen within the first couple of weeks on campus, right? We see students all the time arrive on campus and anecdotally say, I miss my family, I miss home, I'm not socially connected, I'm struggling to become socially connected or find a friend group or a peer group. I don't fit here. I suspect some of those things could be exacerbated under these conditions where you're socially distancing, wearing a mask all the time, staying in your room most of the time. Your social circles are much, much, much smaller. And so I'm very curious if there's any intent on your part to follow this through to the retention side and understand what the impacts could be a little bit further downstream to some of these folks. Oh, and sadly, we lost her right at the end of that question, and she hopefully she'll be back. Oh, she is back. She is back. We got to unmute her again. There she is.
I have a hailstorm here in Big Sky, Montana. I don't know what's going on.
That's the beauty of going live, is these little blips get in here for our live audience. We will cut them out and make a beautiful podcast.
Awesome. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Well, to answer your question, though, I mean, add on top of what you just said, the anxiety created by the possibility of getting a deadly virus. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, our students' mental health, and there's been a lot written about this, is just another layer of anxiety that's laid on top of all of these issues about how to just fit in and, translate into the college experience. But I got to tell you, I mean, I still remain extremely optimistic about higher education, and I can't help it. But I just believe it's absolutely an essential service. I think that colleges and universities are as essential in our country as hospitals and fire stations and policemen. They educate our young people. Our college campuses are doing the research that is going to find the vaccine to this virus. We're doing the research that's going to cure cancer and save the planet and end world hunger and poverty. I mean, they will survive. They may look very different, but they will survive. They must. And I think, to the value of a college degree to the individual is undeniable. I mean, we know that people are happier, live fuller, more fulfilling lives, earn more over their lifetime if they have a college degree. So I don't think it's going anywhere. It just may look very different, and it's going to be a real struggle for a little while.
So we have learned a lot tonight. We have learned that in the micro, students under these conditions may not want to come back as badly as we thought they wanted to come back, or may prefer some alternative modes of delivery of education when they come back. We have learned that students may not behave the way that we hope they're going to behave, and they're even self-reporting that not only do they plan on maybe not doing the things we hope that they're going to do, but they definitely don't trust their peers to do that same thing. And I think we've also revealed that the three of us believe very fervently in higher education and what it means and what it can be and the important role that it serves for us. I can't thank the two of you enough for spending time with me this evening. This data is mind-blowing, and I know it's going to be shared in a lot of different places. We got a lot of different little tweetable moments out of this pod that we're going to be posting up on the web as we go. Brandon, thanks for your response to all of it and helping us to see our way through this. Come back next week. We've got another episode of The Placemakers. We're going to focus in on some of these housing folks because housing has really become front and center, especially in these hybrid models as people are trying to figure out, is this the place where campus life is happening now? Because there's a lot fewer places where it's going to happen beyond that. So come back next week and enjoy it. For tonight, we thank you and say have a great night.